recording.
I'd like to welcome everybody into the very first episode of Utah State of Mind. I will be your host, Jim Spiewak, and today we're going to dive into the topic that has been gaining increasing attention as of late, the epidemic of loneliness and isolation. Loneliness and social disconnection have become really pervasive issues impacting individuals of all ages and backgrounds. Today, we will be discussing a new report titled Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation that was put out recently by the U.S. Surgeon General. This report sheds light on the consequences of social disconnection and the need for action to address the growing problem. The report also reveals that Americans are becoming less socially connected over time. It highlights the impact of social disconnection on our health, equating the mortality impact of being socially disconnected to that of smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. In fact, the harmful consequences of social disconnection are even greater than those associated with things like obesity and physical inactivity, according to this report. But what exactly are the individual health outcomes associated with social disconnection? How does social isolation and loneliness affect our mental and physical well-being? And what can be done to reverse this trend, if anything at all, and foster greater social connection in our communities? To help us better navigate through some of these questions and to gain a better understanding and context around this issue, we have invited in Jen Oxborough to join us today. Now, Jen is a licensed clinical social worker, a former director of the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, and she's also a former head of the Department of Human Service, or I should say a Department of Human Services administrator. And in that role, Jen, you really oversaw a lot of the funding and the dollars that were allocated throughout the entire state around mental health resources. Is that correct?
That's right. I was part of a team with the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health that passed through funding to the county level to make sure that mental health services were available statewide.
So when we talk about mental health and mental illness, this is a world that you really know really well, that you're ingrained in, that you help a lot of people out with and have for a long, long time. So thank you very much for joining us.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I have this sort of overarching idea as we talk about loneliness. You know, we live in a world where we have never been more connected. We are more connected now than ever before. But according to this report, we're also more lonely than we have ever been before. How do we help understand that? Where do we even begin with that? We're more connected, but we're more lonely. How?
I think the way that we're connecting is shifting. I think through technology changes, through our daily lives, the way that our lives are structured now, we're connecting in very different ways than we used to. I think this is really evident, especially in our children. There's a lot more screen time. We feel like we're connecting with people virtually, but you know, it's different than when you and I were kiddos and we were riding our bikes and out playing with people in person. The world has shifted quite a bit, and it has for adults too.
So you and I are sitting 3 feet apart from each other. We're talking face to face. I can see your facial expressions. I can see and hear inflection in your voice. Are we kind of saying that if I were to just send you a text message right now, you couldn't get that same connection as, even if I said the exact same thing, like, "Hi Jen, how are you?" We won't get that same connection through a digital social message?
I think digital social messaging, virtual connection should be one of many ways, hopefully, that we connect. I think when it replaces all of the ways that we connect, we start to see that isolation. And we see this as mental health professionals with regard to telemedicine too. Telemedicine's been great in so many ways. It has helped us, especially through the pandemic, to make sure that we can continue services safely and still extend out into rural communities and underserved communities that might not be able to come into our clinic. But it also precludes the ability to see some of those nonverbal expressions, right? Like seeing if someone is demonstrating nonverbally that they're uncomfortable or anxious or fearful. That's harder to pick up through telemedicine. So there's some blessings and some curses, some limitations for sure.
Yeah, maybe some unintended consequences,
Yeah,
so to speak. So is there a false sense of connection through things like social media? You mentioned technology. social media has been around since maybe the early 2000s with Friendster, MySpace, but then it really exploded with things like Facebook, and now we've got TikTok, we've got Snapchat. I was just sitting in the dentist office the other day with my children, and we were waiting, and there was someone that came in, and they looked to be early teens, and they were there by themselves, so maybe they just got dropped off, maybe 16-ish, somewhere around that range, and their face was 5 inches from their phone for about 30 minutes. They never looked up. Yeah. And it just made me think, this person is so ingrained and connected into that digital device. Didn't even know what was going on around them, really.
Right. We're seeing this a lot, and I think it becomes a little confusing, perhaps, to us when we're clicking in and, our connections on Facebook are our friends, right? I hear this from young people who are into online gaming, my friends that I play with, and then I'll talk to them about that. Like, have you met them in person? Do you know them in person? How well do you know them? What's your connection like outside of gaming? And often, typically, it's not, someone that you're going to call if you're having a problem, or it's not someone you're going to confide in, right? You may have 1,000 friends on Facebook. How many of those are people that you could call and say, I need to talk to somebody, I'm having a hard time. And I think a lot of those social media platforms reinforce the stress of being okay, being perfect, in fact, being Instagrammable, right? And so there's this added pressure to be strong, be capable, be perfect, and be okay, and that can filter for connection as well.
So if some generations are putting more emphasis on being recognized and appreciated in the digital world as opposed to the real world, can that make us more lonely? Like, I hear this adage that people, in whatever the metaverse is going to be, they would rather have a digital Rolex on their avatar in the metaverse than wear a real Rolex in real life. It's more prestigious.
Yeah, I think it gives us a chance. I worry about this a lot. It gives us a chance to put ourselves out there as a very different version, right, than who we really are. I've worked over the years as a therapist with people who struggle with agoraphobia. Some of them struggle with profound obesity. They're very afraid sometimes to leave their home because of trauma experiences.
Is that what agoraphobia is?
Agoraphobia
afraid to
is,
leave?
Yeah, it's a phobic fear where it is impairing your ability to leave your home.
Okay.
And so in some ways, technology is helpful. I can work with that person, again, through telemedicine. They can order their groceries online and their medications online, but some of them will go days, weeks, even months without leaving their home. And they can put themselves out there as an avatar, as a participant in an online gaming community, as a very different version of themselves than who they really are. And that isolation can have really compounding effects.
Can you help us understand, take us into the mind of someone that is lonely? Not everyone out there is lonely. I mean, I'm sure we all feel loneliness in parts of our lives, but people that are really struggling with loneliness, what is running through their mind? What are they feeling? What are they thinking? What are they experiencing in your experience that from the folks that you work with and talk with?
Such a good question. And when we were talking about this before, I started thinking about this. I think there's a real important difference between loneliness and being alone. I think when we think of loneliness, we often think of people who are alone, singular, right, in a room, the kind of situation I just described. I think there's also a kind of loneliness that's happening where people are with people all day, sometimes even in person, but aren't really feeling connected, aren't really feeling understood or seen. And I think in cases where I've worked with people who have died by suicide, the surviving community, family, friends, really struggle with that. Like, I just saw this person, I just saw this person for dinner, or I just saw this person at this gathering or this family event or work event, and I had no idea. And usually there is a profound sense of loneliness that's happening for that person too that we can't quite understand. So I think it's important to think of loneliness. Feeling lonely when you're surrounded by people is also a very big reality for us, and something that we need to be talking about.
And they can mask it on social media. They can
Sure.
put up a selfie of a smile, and then they can take it even a step further and put a filter over their face to make them look even more perfect.
Sure.
But inside, they might really be struggling, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, we've seen this with some high-profile deaths by suicide
Yeah.
recently. People who were putting themselves out there realistically. The mommy blogger who was known as Juice. I think that really gave people a lot of pause and a lot of things to think about, where she was being vulnerable, she was revealing herself, and continued to feel lonely and isolated and hopeless in some ways. And I think the hopelessness is the thing that I start to recognize as a really significant risk factor for dying by suicide. When people don't have any hope that the loneliness will go away or subside, when they don't have any hope that things will change, that's where I think we get those worst outcomes.
Warning signs, if you're a family member, a friend, a loved one, how do we see a warning sign that someone's starting to experience some serious loneliness?
I think first and foremost, trust yourself. If something feels off when you're talking to someone that you know and care about, someone that you work with, if something just feels intuitively off, trust yourself. We're pretty, we're pack animals, right? We're used to clanning, and so we're very attuned to each other in a lot of ways that we don't even fully recognize. And so if something feels off to you, if you have a concern, validate that for yourself, and then find a safe way to talk about that, a respectful way to talk about that. I think being able to have a relationship with someone where you can say, hey, I've been thinking about you, I've been wondering how you're doing, and I just want you to know that, and I'm here, and if there's anything I can ever do for you, I'm here, and I want you to know that. That means so much to people. I think people often that I've worked with who are at the highest risk will talk about, it's been days or weeks or months since anyone has even made eye contact with me. And that's especially true like when I've been working with people in the unsheltered population and homelessness communities. They're really ignored and overlooked purposefully because it's uncomfortable, right? So whether it's a coworker or a stranger on the street, being able to be human and make eye contact, shared dignity, right, which is different than respect. Just meet someone with that basic human dignity. Doesn't cost us anything. Doesn't challenge our safety in any way. It could be the very thing that makes a huge difference to someone.
And should parents be opening up this dialogue with children if they maybe see a child acting in a different way? Is too young? Is there an age that's maybe too young to start opening up a dialogue with a child around these types of issues?
I think we should have these dialogues in an age-appropriate way across the lifespan. We have a conversation with a 3-year-old in a very different way than we do a 13-year-old, your father. That conversation evolves and changes and takes on new layers as time goes by. My son is in his 20s and living outside of the country, and I'm still dialoguing with him. And it has a lot of the same themes that it did when he was 5. So being able to have that conversation throughout, parents often will ask mental health professionals, when should I start talking about this? I would say, like driving, for example, we don't just start teaching our kids how to drive when they're 16. They're passengers in cars their whole lives before that, so they're learning how to drive and how to be respectful and how to handle stress and different situations as a passenger all along. We can learn and have conversations and dialogue across the lifespan.
Is loneliness, in your mind, different than social disconnection? Because this report mentions social disconnection, it mentions this term loneliness. Are they one and the same, do you think? Is there some overlap? Are they maybe a little bit different?
I think loneliness to me is a feeling. Social disconnection is a situation. So if I'm socially disconnected, I might be isolating, I might be limited in some way. Loneliness to me, and for a lot of the clients and patients that we've tried to serve over the years, is a profoundly heavy feeling. It's very heavy, right? It's up there with fear, shame, guilt. So loneliness has often a a sense of rejection. People don't want to be with me, right? I'm not good enough, I'm different, there's something wrong with me, is often the thought process that underlies that feeling of loneliness. And I'm a dialectical behavior therapist, so I think a lot of the connection between what we think and how that drives our feelings and emotions, which I just did with you right there, but I do think that thought process of there's a problem with me is often what results in that feeling of loneliness.
But the two converge because you talk about a feeling, one being a feeling and one being sort of a situation. When those two converge, and maybe in a negative way, they can have real health impacts on people. And this report mentions some of that. Lacking social connection and loneliness significantly linked to an increased risk of premature death from all causes, suicide being one of them. Social disconnection has been found to have impacts on cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, infectious disease, cognitive function, depression, anxiety, and self-harm. So when those two converge, it can get dangerous.
Yeah, in about 2012, we started looking at a statewide level in Utah at our very concerning rates of suicide. And we looked to experts nationally, looked a lot to the Benson Henry Institute, and started looking at the correlation to adverse childhood experiences. So researchers like Drs. Felitti and Anda, who were initially studying how our childhood experiences affected our whole health across our life. The National Institute of Health showed way back in like 2011 that there was a really concerning comorbidity factor. So if someone had profound, serious, persistent mental illness, they were much more likely to also have very significant physical health problems as well. When you look back at adverse childhood experiences, kids that grow up in a home where there's a lot of violence, aggression, maybe they're living with someone, an adult reliant on a caregiver who has untreated mental illness, they've lost a parent to death or divorce or incarceration. These are very profound risk factors, and Felitti and Anda, the authors of those studies, and the CDC didn't look at poverty. They didn't look at socioeconomic factors. They looked at experiences. What they found is those children were much more likely to have serious physical health implications, just like the NIH found, and serious mental health risks over the lifetime. Much more likely to intersect with a higher ACE score. The more of those situations you experienced in childhood, much more likely to intersect the criminal justice system, much more likely to be at risk of teen pregnancy, teen smoking, much more likely to have a risk of suicide and self-harm. So the exact things you just described. To me, what that means is when there are risk factors in someone's life, whether you're a child or an adult, you are much more likely to isolate, you are much more likely to be sedentary, right? If things are scary at home, I'm not going to invite my friends over to play, right? If my parents are at risk, if my caregivers are at risk, they're much less likely to be doing my homework with me, they're much less likely to be having family dinner regularly and encouraging me to go make pro-social relationships happen. And so those behaviors that happen in childhood carry through into our adult lifetime. And now we're at risk of diabetes, now we're at risk of heart disease, now we're at risk of all of these other intersections in the criminal justice system and in the health system as well. So it's all related. And I think starting with children, right, is where we can really make a big difference. And with technology right now, it is just essential to recognize how important it is to stay connected, truly connected, not only virtually, earlier in life.
So are you talking about maybe one way is setting some limits?
Yeah.
Setting some screen time limits, setting some social media limits with the kiddos?
Yeah, you know, there's this technique that therapists use that is, we have like a love-hate relationship with it, but it's called the Pomodoro technique, and it's basically where you say, I'm going to do a thing for a period of time and then take a break. So that might be like 20 minutes on and now 10 minutes off. It's a great way for parents to balance out. So instead of saying you can't do this, I always try to encourage people to think about how they will manage it. right? So instead of imposing a penalty and saying you can't have screen time or you can't do that right now, you can't do that until after you get your homework done, changes in language that work more like this, where you would say, we're going to do homework for 20 minutes and then you get 10 minutes of screen time. We're going to do that until you're done with your assignment, or we're going to spend some time together as a family, go in for a walk for 20 minutes, and then when we come home you have 10 minutes of screen time. So it's about what you are doing instead of what you aren't doing. Children a lot of times will say, my parents have all these rules and they tell me all these things I can't do. They'll tell us that as therapists. And we listen and observe, especially in parental evaluation. We're watching really closely for those parenting strategies and techniques. And that there's a tendency, don't touch that, don't run in front of the car, don't do this. We're trying to keep our kids safe all the time, and we're telling them what not to do. Maybe turning that over and helping them know how to manage technology, how to manage the virtual world that's expanding for them can be helpful and also improve that relationship.
Guilty as charged. Stop doing that, kiddo. Stop doing that. I'm going to start flipping that around.
Yeah.
I think that is a great piece of advice right there. So that's maybe one actionable step for the children. What about for an adult? I know that we're not going to solve the issue of loneliness overnight, but what would be one thing you could tell someone that's an adult if they are experiencing some loneliness?
That you are not alone. That may be a thought, that may be a story that plays through your head every single day. One of the beautiful things, one of the best benefits of this technology that's advancing in our world is that there are lots of ways to connect if you need help. So first and foremost, Utah has made huge investments in lots of different options for people if they're ever at risk. The SafeUT app, the MCOT teams, the mobile crisis outreach teams are amazing. There are lots of different types of crisis centers. So if it's to that level, please know where to turn, and we can share lots of resources with your listeners.
Yeah, we will link those in all of the platforms that we put this on. We'll link a lot of those resources.
If it's a lower key, less high-risk situation, looking for small steps, making a big change and suddenly joining a book club or adding in a daily activity can feel really overwhelming for people. Small steps, so starting to walk to the mailbox and do it at the same time every day, and try to engage with the neighbor on your way to do that. Stopping at a coffee shop in the morning and getting to know someone by name, that very small thing, right? Look at their name badge, greet them by their name. Small pieces of connection. It can even happen in traffic. When I was driving here, somebody smiled at me because I stopped and gave them lots of space to clear the crosswalk ahead of time, and he smiled and waved, and I smiled and waved back at him, and I'm thinking about him an hour later, those small pieces of connection, sharing really common things. I walk in crosswalks, I appreciate it when people treat me that way. So it goes back to that dignity thing, that human piece, that connection piece, really small things that you can start to do daily, and that will blossom, that will grow. Have you heard of the Rosetto study by chance?
I have not, no.
The Rosetto study showed that this group of Italian men who walked to work every day, I think it was back in the 40s or 50s, even though they were Italian-American men and they ate a really traditional Italian diet.
A lot of carbs.
I
Right.
think most of them were smokers.
Right.
They were drinking wine, traditionally with their Italian dinner every night. But because they worked together and they walked to work together every day, they basically had zero heart disease.
Wow.
So I think that the resilience that comes with that, the physical and mental resilience that comes with that, they also had a very long lifespan. And then the cool thing about that, epigenetics, I think they passed that on to their descendants.
Right.
Because the next generation had lower rates of heart disease.
Wow.
Their wives and their friends had lower rates of heart disease. And we weren't assessing for mental health outcomes back then, but I bet they were doing pretty well that way too.
And they got to eat pasta and drink wine every day.
That's right.
So we started out this conversation by talking about we've never been more connected than ever before, but we're seemingly never been more lonely than ever before. Can we exist in a world where we stay just as connected, or maybe even more connected, but become less lonely?
I sure hope so. And I think that this conversation is what is going to help us achieve that. It can be really hard to admit that you're struggling with loneliness. And so having a conversation like this really brings it forward. It elevates, you kind of went first, Jim. You're sort of pushing me in the pool here to talk about loneliness today. And so I think that's what needs to happen is, and I worry about this for men in particular, because I think we have really modeled some unhealthy masculine traits that you need to be strong and you need to be solid and you need to, be okay. And same for mothers. I think the author I was talking about before, Deuce, excuse me, really got at that a lot, that she was struggling. And also she loved her kids. It was both and, right? It was both hard and she loved her kids. So with loneliness, I can, if I can admit I am lonely, I am both lonely, and I want more connection, and I want to work on that, and I want the people around me that I trust to know this, I think that's where we begin to address that.
You don't have to just live alone to be lonely. Can someone be lonely while existing in a family setting or some other type of setting where they do have a lot of people around them? I think maybe we even talked about that a little bit earlier. It's not just this person that is living alone by themselves.
Yeah, I think as a therapist, one of the themes that I hear often is exactly that, when a person feels a little different than their family, when maybe their belief system is a little different or their lifestyle is a little different. There's a lot of loneliness that may be coming from their own story, their own thoughts. My family won't understand me, my family will judge me, or my people, whoever it is that I'm connected to, there will be a penalty. So that's where I was talking about that cognition, that thought really underlies a lot of our feelings, and our feelings drive our behaviors. So if I'm thinking I'm going to be rejected if I start to connect and be more authentic and open with these people, then I will behave with more withdrawn behavior. And then it's a bit of a catch-22, right? Because now I'm distancing myself a little bit more. So
Right. So Jen, I end every interview by asking, what did I miss? What else should we know?
I think, and you know this because you do such a good job with this, but resources, helping people understand that there is research, there is data behind this. This isn't something that you're alone with. It's not something that you're imagining. And then knowing where to turn, to whatever degree this may be happening in your life or in someone that you care about, their life, knowing where to turn for help. There's nothing wrong with reaching out and saying, hey, this is tough for me, to a friend, to a neighbor, to a therapist, to a doctor. Most people that die by suicide have seen a primary care physician within 30 days prior to their death by suicide.
Really?
Yeah. So I think people have a natural inclination to reach out for help, but sometimes lack the words. So
Wow.
Speak up.
Yeah, I did a piece of reporting with these two amazing men that they were total strangers. One of them was on an overpass on I-15 and he was ready to jump. And this other guy, Joe, he stopped and he just held out his arms and said, "I love you, bro."
Oh.
And he just kept saying those 4 words, "I love you, bro." And he got Aaron down. And now they're really close. They're almost like best of friends. And they've started up a nonprofit specifically to try to help out men who are suffering with mental health issues. And it was what you were just saying right there. Sometimes it's just 4 simple words.
Yep.
Someone just needed to hear, "I love you."
Yeah.
And it saved a life. And it's a really amazing story. And they actually went back to that spot. You would think that would be a spot that would be a trigger.
Yeah.
But they are comfortable in the fact that they can go back there and they actually look at that spot that almost ended it all as a place of like a new beginning.
It was a really beautiful place.
Yeah.
Right? Something really beautiful happened there.
Yeah. And we talked with Aaron and we talked with Joe, and so we've reported and heard their story, and Aaron said that he just had these overwhelming thoughts going through his brain on that particular day.
Yeah.
And while he was ready, he wasn't ready.
Yeah.
And Joe was there to save his life.
Most of the people that I've worked with who who have attempted suicide or who lost someone that they care about to suicide, and describe a period of crisis. And so we know if we can interrupt that period of crisis, most people do not want to actually die. They want the hard thing to stop happening. And so maybe the hard thing is this recovery process. If you can be there for somebody in that moment and find a way to interrupt that crisis and give them a different version of that story, it can really make a difference.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jen, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to talk with us through some of these issues. We're going to put a lot of resources. We're going to link them in this podcast. We're going to link them online in our YouTube. So we'll get all of those resources out there. And with Utah State of Mind, we're going to continue this reporting going forward. It's not just going to be a one and done. We're going to be talking about these issues a lot. So we'd love to have you back in the future. We do appreciate all of your time and your context and perspective. And I'd just like to thank everyone for listening and watching. Again, I'm Jim Spiewak. This is Utah State of Mind, episode 1, where we talked about the idea and the notion of loneliness, and that we've never been more connected before, but we are seeing data that show that we've never been more lonely than ever before in some of the ways to try to combat this, what is becoming an epidemic, according to the Surgeon General. So thanks again, Jen, for your time and your context. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
You bet.
Let's get a quick gaslight, just in case.
Yeah.
That was so